The pine branches bent low under fresh snow as Margaret walked, her daughter's small hand tucked firmly in her own. 6-year-old Emma said nothing, though her breath came quick in the bitter air. Behind them, the farmhouse they'd called home for 3 years grew distant. That morning, Margaret's mother-in-law had been waiting with cold finality. "You were never truly family," she'd said. "James is gone. The house, the money, it stays with blood. You have until noon." Margaret's father-in-law had stood silent, avoiding her eyes. James had been sick only a week before pneumonia took him. His parents barely acknowledged Emma at the funeral. The child born before their son, a reminder of Margaret's past. To them, Emma was evidence of sin, but there was no room for wounded feelings when night would come in hours. Emma needed warmth, food, shelter. "Mama, where are we going?" Emma's voice was small but steady. "Somewhere safe, somewhere warm." Margaret remembered the cave from years before. She'd found it while gathering mushrooms, noticed steam rising from stones near a rocky outcrop. Inside, warmth poured from deep in the earth, turning the cave entrance into a temperate haven even in winter. It had been her secret place during difficult times. Now it was their only hope. After 2 hours of walking, the Hendersons' cabin appeared. Mrs. Henderson opened the door, sympathy on her face. "Margaret, dear, we heard what happened." "We need," Margaret began, but Mrs. Henderson shook her head sadly. "I'm so sorry. With our children and my mother here, we haven't spare room. John says we can barely manage as it is." She glanced behind her, then stepped out and lowered her voice. "But wait." She returned with a canvas sack. "It's what I could spare without John noticing. A pot, seeds, rope, cloth, a lantern, some potatoes and dried meat at the bottom." "It's everything," Margaret said, throat tight. "Thank you." The cave entrance appeared behind ancient pines, a wide, rocky overhang forming natural shelter. The moment they stepped inside, Emma gasped, "Mama, it's warm." It was remarkably so. After hours in bitter cold, the air felt almost balmy, perhaps 50 degrees. The warmth rose from deep within the cave system, a gift from the earth. The entrance chamber was maybe 30 feet deep and 20 wide, the ceiling arching 12 feet high, blackened from ancient fires. "We'll build here," Margaret said, studying the space, "where the warmth is strongest." She chose a spot against the back wall where rock would provide structure and insulation. That first night tested her determination. She gathered deadfall while Emma collected kindling, built a fire with shaking hands, striking sparks until flames caught. The smoke rose and dissipated naturally through the entrance. For their first meal, Margaret roasted a potato in the coals. They shared it, savoring every bite. Later, Emma asked for a story, and Margaret spoke of summer gardens and warm bread until her daughter fell asleep. Sitting alone by the fire, Margaret planned. They needed walls, storage, better sleeping arrangements, reliable water. She thought of those who'd cast them out, then pushed bitter thoughts away. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. As she banked the fire for the night, Margaret made a promise. They would not merely survive. They would build a home. Over the following days, Margaret began the work of construction in earnest. She rose with the first gray light, leaving Emma sleeping under every piece of clothing and cloth they owned, and ventured into the forest. The hatchet James had given her, a small camp axe really, not a felling tool, had been tucked in a pocket of her dress, overlooked by her in-laws in their rush to dispossess her. It was dull from lack of sharpening, but it was what she had. The forest provided. Fallen logs lay everywhere, blown down by wind or weighted down by snow until they cracked. Margaret selected pieces she could manage, 6 to 8 inches in diameter, 4 to 6 feet long. Anything bigger would be impossible for her to move alone. She trimmed smaller branches from the logs using the hatchet, then dragged them back to the cave one by one, the bark scraping trails through the snow. Emma woke on the second day of this work and insisted on helping. "I can carry small ones, Mama. Please." So Margaret gave her tasks, gathering thin branches for support beams, clearing stones from the building area, and most importantly, keeping the fire fed while Margaret worked. Emma took her responsibilities seriously, checking the fire every few minutes, adding sticks when the flames grew low. The cabin's design emerged from necessity and available materials. Margaret positioned the structure against the back wall of the cave entrance, using the natural stone as the rear wall. This saved lumber and provided excellent insulation. She started by setting corner posts, 4 upright logs, each about 7 feet tall, that she positioned and braced with smaller stones wedged at their bases. Getting them perfectly vertical took patience. She used a weighted string as a plumb line, adjusting and readjusting until the posts stood straight. "Hand me that rope, sweetheart," she called to Emma, and her daughter carefully brought the hemp rope Mrs. Henderson had provided. Margaret lashed horizontal support beams between the corner posts, creating a frame. The knots had to be tight. She used square lashings and clove hitches, knowledge from watching her own father build sheep pens years ago. Each joint was tested, shaken, retested. The walls came next. Margaret set vertical logs close together between the support beams, creating a palisade-style wall. Each log was different, some straight, some curved, some thick, some thin. She worked with what she had, fitting them together like puzzle pieces, placing wider logs at the bottom for stability. Emma helped by holding boards steady while Margaret lashed them in place, and by passing tools and rope when Margaret's hands were full. "You're my best helper," Margaret told her, and Emma beamed. The gaps between logs were the next challenge. Wind could cut through the smallest cracks, stealing their precious warmth. Margaret gathered mud from a spot inside the cave where the ground warmth had kept it soft. She mixed it with dry grass, creating a primitive mortar. Emma helped pack this mixture into gaps, her small fingers able to reach places Margaret's couldn't. Then they stuffed cloth scraps from Mrs. Henderson's sack into the larger gaps, pushing them deep before adding another layer of mud. "It looks messy," Emma observed. "It looks lived in," Margaret corrected. "It looks like survival." The roof was perhaps the most challenging part. Margaret created a slanted surface using overlapping pieces of bark she'd peeled from fallen logs, layering them like shingles from bottom to top so water would run off. She weighted the bark down with smaller branches lashed across them, creating a grid that held everything in place. The roof sloped back against the cave ceiling itself, using the natural rock as the final barrier against the elements. For the door, Margaret built a simple frame and wove branches between vertical supports, creating a wattle barrier. It wasn't beautiful, but it could be propped closed to hold in heat or opened to allow airflow. A piece of leather she'd cut from her own belt served as a crude hinge. The cabin took shape slowly, hour by hour, day by day. Margaret's hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached from bending and lifting. But the structure grew. 4 walls, a roof, a doorway, a haven. Inside was barely 10 feet square, but it was enclosed, insulated, and positioned to capture the cave's warmth. Emma helped mortar the final gaps, patting the mud mixture smooth with a flat stone. "We built this," she said wonderingly. "We did," Margaret confirmed, every single piece. She spent another full day improving their seal against drafts. She gathered moss from the north sides of trees where it grew thick, packed it between the logs, and covered it with more mud. She found a hunter's abandoned shelter a quarter-mile away, just a lean-to, collapsed and useless, and salvaged boards from it, using them to reinforce weak spots in their walls. The work of construction taught Emma lessons beyond building. She learned patience, that rushing led to mistakes that had to be fixed. She learned measurement, understanding that spacing between logs mattered, that walls had to be vertical, that balance was crucial. She learned problem solving. When a log wouldn't fit, they trimmed it, or found a different log, or changed the design slightly. Most importantly, she learned that her efforts mattered, that her small hands could contribute to something important. During construction, Margaret explored the cave by lantern light, while Emma napped. 20 paces from their building site, she heard dripping water. A thin trickle emerged from a crack in the rock wall. Clear, clean, faintly warm. She could capture it, create a basin. Over 2 days, she built a collection point. Flat stones arranged in a bowl shape, the largest forming the base with a natural depression. She built up sides with smaller stones, packing them with a mixture of clay-rich mud, ash, and sand. The second batch held better than the first. "What are you making?" Emma asked. "A sink. The water will flow here, and we can use it for washing, drinking, cooking." She built the basin walls 6 inches high, creating a pool 18 inches across. For drainage, she carved a notch in one edge and built a small channel of flat stones leading to a natural floor crack. When she tested it, water flowed perfectly from basin to channel to drain. "It's like magic," Emma exclaimed. "It's better than magic. It's engineering." The basin became central to daily life. They washed faces and hands there each morning, rinsed vegetables, cleaned dishes, filled the cooking pot. Margaret even washed their hair weekly, heating water first, then pouring carefully while Emma leaned over the basin. "We're fancy cave ladies," Margaret said, working ash and fat soap through her daughter's hair. The constant trickle meant never worrying about water, a simple luxury in winter. With water secured and shelter built, Margaret turned her attention to food. The seeds from Mrs. Henderson were precious beyond measure, a packet of lettuce seeds, another of spinach, and what appeared to be turnip or radish greens. In winter, with no store and no money, these seeds represented life itself. But seeds needed soil, and soil needed structure and care. Margaret had noticed during her forest trips that beneath the snow and fallen pine needles, the earth was rich and dark, years of decomposed organic matter creating a nutrient-dense growing medium. This was what she needed. She just had to get it to the cave. She built the raised bed frames first. The collapsed hunter's shelter had yielded rough boards, weathered but still serviceable. Margaret selected the sturdiest pieces and constructed 2 rectangular boxes, each about 3 feet by 4 feet and 10 inches deep. She used spare rope to lash the corners tight, then braced them with stakes driven into the ground. "Why boxes, Mama?" Emma asked. "Because boxes hold the soil up where it's easier to work with," Margaret explained. "And they keep the growing area warm, warmer than the ground itself. The wood holds heat from the cave, and that helps the plants grow even in winter." She positioned the beds carefully, near the cave entrance where natural light filtered in strongest, but far enough inside that drafts wouldn't freeze the plants. The warm air from deeper in the cave would circulate around the beds, and the filtered light would provide enough energy for leafy greens to grow. Then came the hard work, gathering soil. Margaret took the canvas sack and Emma's smaller cloth bag and headed into the forest. She found spots where the cave's warmth had seeped out through the ground, making the earth workable. She dug carefully, scooping the dark, crumbly soil into the sacks. "Why is it black?" Emma asked. "Because it's full of old leaves and rotted wood," Margaret said. "Trees drop their needles and leaves every year, and they fall to the ground and rot. That rotting makes food for new plants. It's like the forest eating itself and making itself stronger." Each trip to collect soil was exhausting. The sacks were heavy, the forest floor uneven, the weather unpredictable. Margaret made perhaps 20 trips over 3 days, with Emma helping to carry the smaller bag when it wasn't too heavy. They hauled the soil back to the cave, dumping it into the wooden frames a little at a time. But soil alone wasn't enough. Margaret had learned years ago that good garden soil needed texture and nutrients. She mixed in wood ash from their fire. Not too much, but enough to add minerals and balance acidity. She added crushed leaves, bits of grass, even their own compostable scraps. The skins from the few potatoes they'd eaten, spoiled plant matter, anything that would break down and enrich the soil. She used her hands to mix everything thoroughly, breaking up clumps, working the amendments into the earth until the whole bed had a consistent texture. Dark, loose, slightly crumbly, rich with potential. Emma helped, her small hands patting and mixing, learning by doing. When both beds were filled, a back-breaking week of work, Margaret let them sit for 2 days, allowing the soil to settle and warm. She watered them lightly from bowls filled at the spring basin, letting the moisture seep through the soil layers. She turned the soil again, fluffing it up, making sure air could reach all the way to the bottom of the beds. Finally, it was time to plant. Margaret opened the seed packet with trembling fingers. Inside were perhaps 24 tiny seeds, each one a promise. She'd planted gardens before, but never one where failure meant going hungry. She showed Emma how to prepare the bed. Using a straight stick, they drew shallow furrows in the soil, each one perhaps half an inch deep, running the length of the bed. The furrows were spaced 4 inches apart, giving the plants room to grow without crowding. "Now watch," Margaret said. She placed seeds in Emma's palm, 3 of them. "We want to space them about this far apart. See? About 2 inches. That way, each plant has enough room for its roots and leaves." Emma concentrated fiercely, placing each seed with care. Margaret followed behind, gently brushing soil over the planted seeds, not burying them too deep, just enough to cover them and keep them moist. They planted lettuce in one bed, spacing the seeds precisely, checking and double-checking their work. In the second bed, they planted spinach along one side and the greens along the other, creating sections within the frame. When all the seeds were planted, Margaret showed Emma how to water properly. "Not too much. We don't want to wash the seeds away or drown them. Just enough to keep the soil moist, like a wrung-out cloth." They used a shallow wooden bowl, dipping it in the spring basin and carrying it carefully to the beds. Margaret let water trickle from the bowl onto the soil surface, moving slowly across each section. The soil darkened as it absorbed moisture, turning from light brown to deep chocolate. "Now we wait," Margaret said, "and we watch, and we water carefully every day, and we hope." The first sprouts appeared on the 5th day. Margaret was checking the beds in the morning, as had become her routine, when she saw them. Tiny green shoots pushing up through the dark soil, reaching for the light. She called Emma over, her voice catching with emotion. Look what we made." Emma peered close, her eyes going wide. "They're alive." "They are. We planted them, and they grew. We made food from seeds and soil and water. Over the following days, more sprouts appeared. Margaret tended them with obsessive care, checking twice daily, adjusting their position slightly to catch better light, watering in the morning when the cave air was coolest. She learned to read the plants. If leaves drooped, they needed water. If they yellowed, perhaps too much water, or not enough light. Some seedlings were weak, growing spindly and pale. Margaret made a hard choice and thinned them, pulling out the weakest plants to give the strong ones more resources. It hurt to destroy even failed plants, but it was necessary. Emma cried the first time she saw her mother pull a seedling. But it was growing. It was, but not well enough, Margaret explained gently. If we leave all the weak ones, they take food and water from the strong ones, and then nothing grows well. This way, we save the best plants and give them the best chance. It's not cruel. It's practical. Emma learned to identify which plants to thin, developing an eye for healthy growth versus struggling survival. She learned to check the soil moisture by pressing her finger into it. Dry soil meant water time. Damp soil meant wait. She learned that plants near the cave entrance grew faster, but needed more water, while plants toward the back grew slower, but steadier. The garden became Emma's pride and responsibility. Each morning, she reported to her mother on the state of the beds. The lettuce on the left side is getting big leaves. The spinach has 6 new plants. One of the greens is looking droopy. Should we water it? Margaret taught her to harvest properly when the plants matured. We pick the outer leaves first, see? Leave the center growing. That way the plant keeps producing, and we can harvest from the same plant many times. They developed a rotation system. As soon as they harvested a section fully, Margaret replanted seeds there, creating a continuous cycle of growth. The beds were never empty. Something was always sprouting, growing, or ready to pick. The contrast was stunning. Outside the cave, snow fell and temperatures plunged below zero. Inside, green plants flourished in rich soil, their leaves broad and healthy, growing in warmth and filtered light. It shouldn't have been possible, but the cave's unique warmth made it reality. Firewood required constant attention. Margaret taught Emma the routine. Gather fallen branches from the forest edge, carry them to the cave, let them dry near the fire. Split the larger pieces with careful strokes of the hatchet. Stack them neatly against the cave wall where they'd stay dry. They built a substantial pile, organizing it by size. Thick logs for overnight burning, thin kindling for quick heat, medium branches for cooking. We check it every day, Margaret said. Count the pieces. We need to know how long our supply will last. Emma learned to stack properly, alternating directions to keep the pile stable. She learned which wood burned hot and which smoked too much. She learned to keep the lantern filled with precious rendered fat Mrs. Henderson had included, and to place it where it would light their work without risk of fire. Inside the cabin, Margaret created order from necessity. Wooden pegs driven into log walls held rope, netting, bundles of dried herbs she'd gathered before the snow grew too deep. The Hendersons' pot hung from a hook over their hearth, a circle of stones Margaret had carefully constructed inside the cabin, positioned so smoke would rise and escape through gaps in the roof and out the cave mouth. Rough shelves held their few possessions: Emma's spare dress, Margaret's sewing supplies, plates carved from wood, cups, jars for storing foraged goods. The bed was a platform of logs covered with pine boughs and the cloth scraps, topped with every blanket and spare clothing they owned. Beneath, Margaret stuffed dry grass and straw she'd cut from a frozen meadow, creating insulation from the stone floor. A small window, really just a gap between logs, showed the snowy world outside, a reminder of what they'd escaped. Margaret hung a cloth over it at night to hold in warmth. The spring basin became central to their daily life. Margaret showed Emma how to wash her hands properly, how to rinse vegetables from the garden, how to clean their wooden dishes with sand and water. They filled their cooking pot there each evening. Margaret even managed to wash their hair once a week, heating water over the fire and pouring it carefully while Emma leaned over the basin. "It feels fancy," Emma said, giggling as warm water ran through her hair. "We're fancy cave ladies," Margaret agreed, working her daughter's hair into a lather with a sliver of soap she'd made from wood ash and saved fat. Cooking became a careful science. They roasted potatoes in the coals, boiled greens from the garden, made thin soups stretched with wild onions Margaret dug from beneath the snow. The dried meat was rationed, a tiny piece each evening, for strength and salt. Margaret saved scraps, composted peels, wasted nothing. She taught Emma to bank the fire at night, covering the coals with ash to slow their burning, ensuring they'd have embers to restart the flame in the morning. They warmed flat stones by the fire before bed, wrapped them in cloth, and tucked them under the blankets for extra heat. The cabin, small and well sealed, held warmth through the night. Mornings followed a rhythm. Margaret rose first, stirred the fire to life, and set water to boil. Emma woke to warmth and weak tea sweetened with wild mint. They checked the garden together, Emma calling out observations while Margaret made notes in her mind. They tidied the cabin, swept the floor with a broom Margaret had fashioned from bound twigs, organized their supplies. Afternoons were for work, gathering firewood, improving their shelter, foraging when weather permitted, tending the garden, repairing tools, sewing torn clothes. Margaret taught Emma skills as they worked, how to tie proper knots, how to judge if wood was dry enough to burn, how to tell edible plants from poisonous ones. Evenings were for stories. Sitting by the fire, bellies full of simple food, they talked of better days ahead. Margaret told Emma about her own childhood, about spring planting and summer harvests, about the way sunflowers turned to follow the light. Emma shared her thoughts, hopes for the garden, dreams of the day they'd have a real house again, questions about everything. "Will we always live here, Mama?" "For now," Margaret said. "Until spring, certainly. Maybe longer. We're safe here. We have water, warmth, food growing. That's more than many people have." "I like it here," Emma said thoughtfully. "It's cozy." And it was. Despite their poverty, despite the betrayal that had sent them here, despite the winter raging outside, they had created something good. The cave home was warm, organized, productive. The raised beds flourished with dark greens, their leaves broad and healthy. The woodpile stood tall and neat. The spring basin ran clear and constant. The cabin, rough but sturdy, kept them safe and dry. One evening, Margaret harvested their first full meal from the garden, enough greens for a proper salad, mixed with wild plants and a precious potato cut into thin slices. They ate slowly, savoring every bite. "We grew this, Mama," Emma said, wonder in her voice. "We did," Margaret agreed, "with our own hands, with dirt and water and care. The grandparents said we had nothing." Margaret paused, then spoke carefully. "They were wrong. We have everything that matters. We have each other. We have skills. We have this place. We have the kindness of good people like Mrs. Henderson. And we have ourselves, our strength, our knowledge, our determination." She gestured around the cave. "Look at what we built. You helped build every part of this. You carried wood, held boards steady, watered these plants, stacked firewood, learned to keep the fire safe. You're 6 years old, and you know how to survive winter." Emma sat straighter, pride glowing in her small face. As weeks passed, their home grew more refined. Margaret built a proper work table outside the cabin door, using it for food preparation and tool maintenance. She hung netting from the cave ceiling to dry herbs and store lightweight items. She organized their baskets and sacks by contents, one for potatoes, one for gathered greens, one for tools, one for cloth scraps and sewing supplies. The garden expanded. Margaret planted new sections as the first greens matured, creating a rotation that ensured constant production. She experimented with spacing, with watering schedules, with positioning plants to catch the best light. Emma learned to identify which plants were ready to harvest, which needed more time, which were bolting and should be pulled. They developed efficiency born of necessity. Morning chores took less time as routines solidified. They knew without discussion who would carry water, who would check the fire, who would harvest greens. They moved through their space with practiced ease, Emma ducking under hanging herbs, Margaret stepping around the garden beds without looking. One night, a fierce storm howled outside. Snow piled against the cave entrance, and wind screamed through the trees. Inside the cabin, Margaret and Emma sat by the fire, warm and secure. The walls held, the roof kept, the fire burned steady. "Are you scared?" Emma whispered. "No," Margaret said, and meant it. "We're safe here. The cave protects us. Our walls are strong. We have firewood, food, water, warmth. Let the storm rage. It can't touch us." Emma snuggled closer. "Tell me about spring." "In spring," Margaret began, "the snow will melt. The forest will turn green. We'll plant a bigger garden, maybe outside the cave if we can protect it. We'll have fresh vegetables, herbs, maybe even flowers. We'll hear birds singing. The air will smell like new grass and pine sap and earth. Will we stay here?" Margaret considered. "I don't know. We'll see what opportunities come. But we'll be strong, you and I. We know how to build shelter, grow food, manage fire, find water. No one can take that knowledge from us. Wherever we go, we'll be able to care for ourselves." "I hope we stay," Emma said. "I like our cave house." Margaret smiled and kissed her daughter's forehead. "Then perhaps we will." The truth was, Margaret had grown fond of their refuge. It was humble, but theirs. No one could evict them. They had built this home with their own hands. As winter deepened, Margaret sometimes stood at the cave entrance watching snow fall while warmth rose from the stone behind her. Her daughter slept safely. Green plants grew. Clean water flowed. They had been cast out with nothing but had created a life filled with warmth, order, and dignity. Margaret thought of her in-laws' bitterness and felt pity. They hoarded property but possessed no real wealth. Here, in this cave, Margaret had riches they couldn't comprehend. Her daughter's love, the satisfaction of work done well, the pride of self-sufficiency, the knowledge that she could face hardship and prevail. Emma stirred, calling sleepily. Margaret turned from the snowy view and went to her daughter, stoking the fire higher, preparing breakfast. Outside, winter raged. Inside, in the warm stone embrace of the cave, mother and daughter built their world. One careful day, one small triumph, one tender moment at a time. The raised beds flourished. The spring basin flowed. The fire burned steady. And in the growing strength of a 6-year-old girl who knew how to stack firewood, tend plants, and face winter without fear, Margaret saw the future taking root, green and strong and impossible to destroy.